final session, we're going to discuss the beast empire, identifying the beast empire. Let's go right to the first slide. In Revelation 17, we have the description of a woman. She's called a harlot, and she is seen to be riding on a beast that says that comes up out of the sea, and that it's also in a desert. This is one of those highly apocalyptic, highly symbolic passages, and as we look at this, you'll see why I emphasize starting with that which is clear, easy to understand, direct, and that which is repeated multiple times, because now we're dealing with some very involved, complex, symbolic passages. So we have the description of this woman. She is both a queen, she is also a harlot. She is seen to be riding on the beast. The beast, okay, it has 7 heads and it has 10 horns. The purpose of this session is to identify both the heads and the horns, because there is a significant measure of information that we can gain from this, critical information. Let's go to the next slide. There is another artistic portrayal of the beast that the woman's riding on. And as you notice, it's kind of an unusual picture, but the beast has 7 heads, and the 10 horns, it needs to be taken note of, all come out of one particular head. They're not dispersed among all the heads. There is one head that has 10 horns. Let's read the passage that we're focusing in on, Revelation 17. The 7 heads of the beast are 7 mountains. Now, as I mentioned earlier, mountains are a very common biblical motif in the Bible, throughout the Bible, for kingdoms. The 7 heads are 7 kingdoms or empires on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. Are you lost yet? 5 have fallen, 1 is, the other has not yet come. That's 7 total. And when he comes, he must continue a short time. And then it gives this final bit of information. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th. Now you're really lost. And is of the 7 and is going to perdition. Let's break this down. First of all, the first point that I want to focus on is that many people throughout history have looked to this passage as, again, one of the passages to prove that the Antichrist would come from Rome, because they've said that this passage is speaking of Rome, which historically has been called the city on 7 hills. The city on 7 hills. However, this position has several significant problems with it. Let's begin to look at some of those. The first problem is that the 7 heads are 7 mountains. Okay? They are called 7 mountains on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. So folks, the problem is that kings and kingdoms correlate nicely, don't they? In fact, it elaborates and it says they are also 7 kings. That establishes the fact that these mountains are in fact kingdoms, and that very common biblical usage of referring to mountains as kingdoms makes sense. For instance, in Obadiah, it's a very teeny little book. It speaks of the mountain of Israel and the mountain of, is it Edom or Moab? Mountain of Moab. It's the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Moab and the clashing of those two in the end times. So the question is, if the hills here are speaking of literal hills, i.e. the city on 7 hills, then how can they also be 7 kings? Otherwise, what the verse says is the 7 heads are 7 literal hills. They are also 7 kings. Kings and hills do not correlate. Kings and kingdoms correlate just fine. Next slide. Now, I quoted Dr. John Walvoord, one of the greatest prophecy teachers and scholars of recent history, and he makes this statement. He says, since the hills represent kings, then they do not refer to the 7 hills of Rome. Okay, so I'm not just out there making up my own claims. This is something that Dr. Walvoord is backing me up on. Next slide. Again, as I said, kings and kingdoms clearly correspond. This is not the case if the mountains or the hills are literal mountains. Okay, next slide. The problem number 2 is that it says the hills fall. How can literal hills fall? Again, quoting Dr. Walvoord, he says, further, a statement is made, 5 have fallen, 1 is. He says the other has not yet come. And then he says this could not refer to hills. It's obviously referring to something other than literal hills. Next slide. The problem number 3, and this is very important because I was just on a radio show the other night, and he said, oh, but the woman, the harlot, is the woman that sits on 7 hills. And he said, and there's only one city in the world that can apply to. Bingo, deal done. And I said, the problem is that the Greek word there is onos. It means mountain. It doesn't even mean hill. Okay, the city of Rome is called the city on 7 hills. There is a Greek word for hill. It's bonos. Okay, that's not the word that the Bible used. Let's go to the next slide. In Luke 3:5, we have a reference to both of those words in one verse. Every valley shall be filled, and every mountain and hill brought low. There you have a distinction. Bonos and oros. Did I get that right? Yeah, bonos and oros. 2 different words. The word there in Revelation is not hill. It's not talking about a city that sits on 7 hills. It's talking about a city that sits on 7 mountains. That is empires, historical kingdoms. Next slide. So here's the sort of kicker, is that Rome, at one time in history when it was being built, did have 7 hills. The problem is today it has at least 9, maybe 10. It's a city that's built on 10 hills. So ultimately, the passage is not speaking about historical Rome way before the 1st century. It's speaking about the end times. Today, the city of Rome is a city that sits on 9 or arguably 10 hills. The passage is talking about a woman or a city that sits on 7 mountains. Okay? Next slide. There you go. Harlot sits on 7 mountains. Rome sits on 10 hills. That equation simply does not work. Next slide. Here's Dr. Walvoord. This is a much better suggestion, and I'm in full agreement with Dr. Walvoord here. He says the mountains refer to the great nations of the past who are empires. 7 great empires of biblical history. That would include Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and ancient Rome. As John viewed it, ancient Rome would be the 6th king. But later in history, Rome would be revived and be considered the 7th king. I disagree with him on the last part of that statement, but we're going to look at and see why. Next slide. Okay, so we have identified so far what the Bible is referring to when it has the beast with 7 heads. It's referring to the 7 biblical historical empires. These empires all bear the same commonalities, the same traits. They were anti-Semitic. They came against the nation of Israel, and then later the Roman Empire during the Christian era also bore a significant anti-Christ spirit, an anti-Christian spirit as well. They were giving trouble to Israel. They represented the dominant false god of the age, each one of these empires did, that stood in opposition to Yahweh, the God of Israel. You know, whether it be the various Egyptian gods or later, you know, the Zeus and the Jupiters and all these. They all were pagan nations that represented the premier premier enemies or competitors, if you will, in the earth to Yahweh, the one true God. Next slide. So here is the traditional position as articulated, as you just saw, by Dr. Walvoord. You have 1 through 7. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, Rome, and then 7, the revived Roman Empire. Okay, that is the traditional position. That is that which is taught by almost all prophecy teachers. Here's the problem with that. Let's look at the next slide. The position has one major fatal flaw, and that's this. There are not merely 7 empires, but 8 There's 8. It mentions 8. Next slide. Ready? Revelation 17:11. The beast that was and is not is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7, and is going to hell. Okay, is going to perdition. Next slide. So here's the problem with the traditional position, is that there are in fact 8. So when you try to insert the equation, insert these nations in, as Walver did and as so many others do, they seem to ignore the fact that there's 8 and not 7. So what happens is, it says, and now get this, at the time that John wrote this verse, at the time that John penned this verse, he says, 5 have been. In other words, 5 are gone. Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece. 5 have been. During the time that John wrote this, 1 is, that's the Roman Empire, right? And he says, and the other will still come. That's 7. And then he mentions an 8th. So the problem is that if we try to say the Rome is the last, the 7th, there's that huge gap. There's that huge void with the 8th empire. If the final empire is the revived Roman Empire, then what's the 8th? We need to understand what the 8th is. Let's go to the next slide. My position, that which I have argued for, and I think which makes very clear sense, is that Rome was the 6th, and then he says the 7th has yet to come. There was another significant world empire, in fact, only one empire in world history that would have the potential to stand with all of these other empires, which ruled the entire Middle East, which carries that anti-Semitic spirit, that anti-Christian spirit, that meets the criteria and fulfills the pattern of ruling in this area after all of these other kingdoms. And that is the kingdom that came after the Roman Empire, which in fact was most responsible for the final defeat of the Roman Empire in 1453, when Mehmet came in and took Constantinople, which was the final capital of the Roman Empire. That the Islamic Empire, which rules the entire Middle East, is in fact the 7th, which from the time of the 7th century, after the death of Muhammad, for 1,400 years, ruled the entire Middle East, right up until just after the turn of the last century, when the Islamic Caliphate was abolished. Okay, the Caliphate, very briefly, is the government of the Caliph. The Caliph, very briefly, is similar to, but greater than, the Pope of Islam, for lack of a better analogy. He is not only a spiritual leader of Islam, he is also the military and political ruler as well. Okay, so right up until 1924, the Islamic Caliphate existed, and then it was abolished. Let's look at that. Next slide. In Revelation 13, verse 3, as well as Revelation 17 and 11, it speaks of one of these heads of the beast experiencing what it calls a fatal head wound. A fatal head wound. Revelation 13:3. And I saw one of his heads, and it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. The wound was healed. Revelation 17:11. And the beast that was, this is the verse we were just looking at, and is not, is himself also the 8th, and is of the 7th, and is going to perdition. So this is both speaking of the same reality. The 7th empire, the empire that comes after Rome, would suffer what the Bible calls a fatal head wound. It appears to be dead, okay? And then it comes back to life. It comes back to life. Here you have my proposition, which is the interpretation of these passages. You have Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, Rome. The 7th is the Islamic Empire, and then the 8th is the revived Islamic Empire. I started to explain when the Islamic Empire experienced the fatal head wound. Next slide. Well, here you have a map of the Middle East, and this describes the various Islamic caliphates. Okay, the Islamic caliphates, you had the Abbasid, the Umayyad, and then later the Ottoman Caliphate. These are the various, let's just think of them as dynasties, the Islamic dynasties, that continually ruled the Islamic world since the time of Muhammad's death, again, right up until 1924, when the Islamic Caliphate culminated with the Ottoman Turkish Empire that ruled the Middle East. Next slide. There's the Turkish Ottoman Empire. Again, it ruled the Middle East as well as a bit up into Europe as well. Next slide. And then in 1924, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk abolished the office of the caliph. He was a secularist, and he believed that Turkey would be far better served with a secular, non-Islamic government. Okay? The Ottoman Empire was beheaded. Then the Western colonizing powers came in and arbitrarily broke up the Middle East and broke up the Ottoman Empire and created the various nation states that exist to this day. For instance, Iraq. That was created by England, and that's part of the reason why we've had some of the problems we've had over the past several years, is that this thing called Iraq was arbitrarily imposed upon a people that they would not have created Iraq as it existed. They would have had the Kurdish north and so forth. We imposed that on them. The Ottoman Empire suffered the fatal head wound, and it is for that reason, because of what Mustafa Kemal Ataturk did, next slide, that throughout the Islamic world he's often portrayed as a secret Jew. You know, he's a secret Jew. Of course, it was a Zionist conspiracy that came in and broke up the Islamic Empire. Okay? So, we have identified the 10 heads. The 7 heads. We have identified the 7 heads as well as the 8th, the final one. The Bible says that after the Roman Empire, another empire would come. There's only one empire that fulfills that could even possibly fulfill that description. The Islamic Empire. The Bible says it would suffer a fatal head wound. In 1924, the Islamic Empire, after having had a succession of caliphs for 1,300 to 1,400 years, was beheaded by Kemal Mustafa Ataturk. Okay? Now, let's look at the 10 horns. The 10 horns are the specific nations that will re-emerge in the last days, that will come together to form the revived beast. These are the 10 nations that will be the primary nations, the primary vehicles of the Antichrist coalition that we are seeing re-emerge before us right now. Okay? Are you all following me? Revelation 17:12. The 10 horns which you saw are 10 kings who have received no kingdom as yet. Okay, the 10 horns are 10 kings. They've received no kingdom as of yet, back in the time of John, but they receive authority for 1 hour as kings with the beast, with the Antichrist. These are of one mind. They have one purpose, to give their power and authority to the beast. They will make war with the Lamb. These are the nations that will fight against Jesus. Okay, next slide. So the 10 kings are the primary nations and their leaders that comprise the coming and final beast empire. Next slide. Of all of the various passages throughout the Bible, and this is why I said Ezekiel 38 is so critical. Ezekiel 38, more than any other passage, prophetic passage, names for us the specific nations that would make up the final Antichrist empire. Better than any other passage, Ezekiel 38 and 39 help us to look out at the world today and identify the specific nations that will form the primary basis of the Antichrist empire. We can watch it forming right before our eyes. Next slide. So here are the nations. Here are the nations, or here are the names mentioned. The first one is Gog. Gog is the leader of the coalition. Gog is from Magog. That's the land of Gog. Then you have Meshech, Tubal, Gomer, Togarmah, Persia, and Put. Okay, you have 7 names mentioned, 7 nations mentioned, and then Gog is the leader. Next slide. This is important. There are two methods of identifying who these nations are. Okay, this is a critical point. The first method is the geographical correlation method. That's what I call it, which is simply to say this. You look to the names mentioned by Ezekiel, you identify where they were located at the time that Ezekiel penned this passage, and then you correlate them to the nations that they correlate to today. Okay? The other method is the ancestral migration method. which is to say, you identify the ethnicity of the peoples that were mentioned by Ezekiel, and then you go on this massive wild goose chase trying to trace the migration and the intermarriage and the intermingling and the moving and the movements of all of these people down through history and try to figure out ethnically who they are today. The problem is that that is almost impossible to do, and anyone who does it is going to come out with 18 different conclusions, and ultimately, because the history of this world is the history of the intermarrying and migration of numerous peoples, you basically end up with the entire world. I mean, or at least most of them, minus a handful of nations. Maybe, Korea's not involved, and you know what I'm saying? I mean, basically, you end up with everybody. So really, most scholars have gone with the geographical correlation method. It's very simple. It makes sense. It doesn't require a thorough understanding of everything that's ever happened throughout history. Next slide. Now, what about Rosh? Joel, you didn't mention Rosh. Okay. Was anybody thinking that? Some prophecy teachers say that there's a word in the passage. It's Rosh. It's a Hebrew word, Rosh. Some people say that that word should be interpreted as a proper noun, and thus among the list of nations, I should add to that another nation, Rosh. So they say it's a proper noun and that it is referring to Russia. I said I would get to this. Many other scholars say that it should not be used as a proper noun, but it should simply be translated as a simple noun or adjective, meaning the head or the chief, the foremost or top. Next slide. Now the first problem with calling Rosh a proper noun and name and then identifying it with Russia, the first problem is that it requires a reliance on the Septuagint. The Septuagint was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament that was made roughly 200 BC. It was commissioned by Alexander in Alexandria. Oh, I'm sorry, it wasn't commissioned by Alexander. It was commissioned by some Greek king, I believe. And it's fraught with problems. I mean, the history of the Septuagint, without getting into it, has a lot of problems, okay? The King James Version, for instance, which, is a fantastic translation, does not use the word Rosh. It simply translates it as chief, head. Now, some of the other translations which rely on the Septuagint do insert that word Rosh, okay? The Septuagint has, as I said, significant problems. When we look to those translations which rely on the Masoretic text, the original Hebrew text, then Rosh is not there, okay? So when you're relying on the translation of a translation, there are some that do use Rosh. When you go right to the original Hebrew in the Masoretic text, the authorized version, and thus the King James, Rosh is not there. So that's the first problem. Second problem is that it takes linguistic liberties. Okay, Rosh is used 598 times in the authorized version, or i.e. in the King James Version. 598 times. Every time it is used to mean head, chief, top, or something similar. Never once is it used as a proper name. Nearly 600 times. It's the same Rosh that we find in the Jewish holiday, Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah, right? It's the head of the year, the Jewish New Year, the chief day of the year, okay? It's a word that most of us are fairly familiar with. It's used that way throughout the Bible. It's never used as a name, okay? Nevertheless, people have tried to find this one usage in Ezekiel and make it a name. Next slide. Here's Dr. Merrill Unger, again, someone who does not have a vested interest in prophecy, but rather a vested interest in the original meaning of the Hebrew. And he says, linguistic evidence for the equation of Rosh with Russia is confessedly only presumptive. So again, this is not little Joel Richardson trying to make statements about the Hebrew. This is Dr. Merrill Unger, a great scholar, and I could cite many others. Edwin Yamachi, another great historian and scholar, also has written a fantastic article saying that the effort to equate Rosh with Russia is in fact done more out of political desire to sort of cast our enemy, Russia, as being in biblical prophecy, whereas the linguistic evidence for that is actually minimal, nominal, or non-existent. Next slide. Problem number 3, and this is key. This is key. This is huge. I mentioned the 2 different methods of identifying the nations. Okay? Now, if you look to many of the different prophecy books that try to say that Rosh is speaking about Russia, they do a little bit of sleight of hand. And here's what it is that if you look at the books, if you look at them, every single time, every nation, whether it be Gomer to Gorma, Magog, they use the geographic method. They locate where it was geographically, and then they identify the modern nations that they correlate to. With Rosh, they switch, and all of a sudden they start using the ancestral method. Because at the time of Ezekiel, the best evidence that anyone can find is that maybe, there may have been a few small bands of people who are called Rosh, who live north of the Black Sea, which is today Ukraine. Okay? So if these teachers were consistent, they would say that the Gog-Magog coalition, if they believe that truly Rosh was a proper name, they would say that it's referring to the Ukraine. But then what they do is they identify all the other names, again, through the geographic correlation method, but when they get to Rosh, it was in Ukraine, and that's not very exciting to say, well, there's going to be a coming Ukrainian invasion of Israel. They go, later those people migrated, and they intermarried with the Rus that came down from Scandinavia, and they intermarried, and they eventually became the Russians. Okay? So they switch it up. They use the geographic method of all of the nations and then switch it up only on Rosh. Inconsistency. Okay? To me, that is what I mean by inflicting interpretive violence on a passage. It's inconsistent. Next slide. There's a few books, popular books that are out today that did exactly that. 2 guys that are, 100 miles above me in terms of qualifications and credentials and scholars, and I respect them both very much. But if you look at what they do in both of their books in trying to identify Rosh as Russia, they do just what I said. They switch methods. They go from the geographic correlation method, they get to Russia, and they simply switch it up. Next slide. Problem number 4 is what I call internal inconsistencies. Okay, follow this. Gog of Magog, okay, Gog, that's the leader of the coalition. He's from Magog, okay, and he's the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, okay. Now, here's the problem, and we're going to look at this in some more detail, so to a degree I'm skipping ahead, but Magog, Meshech, and Tubal are all located in Asia Minor, which today is Turkey, okay. They're all located in Turkey. So this would be similar if, in fact, what it's saying is that Gog is the ruler of Russia, then it would be akin to saying this: you, Obama, of the U.S., Russia, president of Washington and New York. Do you see what I'm saying? It just doesn't make any sense. Suddenly you're trying to make the verse say something which is just completely squirrely. Okay? It doesn't make sense. Next slide. Problem number 5 is that it would cause this verse to be a completely anomalous passage, which is to say, and I mentioned this earlier, that the overwhelming emphasis of all end-time passages, as I've demonstrated to a degree today, I've touched on it today, they all point us to the Middle East. They all point us to the Middle East. Today, folks, because of, again, some of the runaway bestsellers that are out there, again, Joel Rosenberg and some other books, the prophetic imagination of the church is completely fixated on Russia. And when you read the books, all emphasis is placed on Russia, the coming Russian invasion of Israel. Okay? If that is the case, folks, if the Lord was so much trying to emphasize the fact that Russia would come against Israel, then why did he only use one single, highly debatable word to establish that case? And is it responsible biblical hermeneutics to make such a big deal and to place so much emphasis on this supposed invasion based off of one verse. Why is this not emphasized throughout the Bible? Why does it stand in contradiction to that which all the prophets are speaking? Okay? It would be a completely anomalous, unique passage. I don't believe the Lord would leave us hanging with such a lack of information. He would emphasize this all over the place. Next slide. Number 6 is that it relies on what I call newspaper eschatology. Okay, newspaper eschatology is what's called eisegesis. That means you open the newspaper, you read about what is taking place in the world, and then you open the pages of the Bible and you try to find it. Okay? And you try to read into the Bible your worldview and the news that you read about in the newspaper. Exegesis is that you begin with the Bible, and in a responsible way, you do your best using all of the tools that you're, all of the resources that you have, you as responsible as you can, pull out what the Bible is saying, and then you look to the newspaper to confirm these things, to be a watcher, to be watchful. Okay? So what happens is whenever I present this information, I lay out the problems with the idea that Rosh is speaking about Russia, and there's inevitably someone that says, yeah, but Joel, haven't you been reading what's taking place in the world with Russia? They're reasserting their strength. Putin is the new czar, and they're arming Iran, and they're doing this. And I go, yeah, they are, absolutely. But it doesn't change the fact that I don't think the Bible's talking about Russia, and I can't change that. The Bible is not emphasizing it. And then secondly, I would simply point this out. Okay, yeah, Russia is arming Iran, and they're doing some things, and they have their own squirrely foreign policy, and they're looking out after their own interests, right? They're reasserting their strength. But do you know something? The United States created Saddam Hussein, didn't they? The United States funded and virtually created the Taliban, didn't they? The United States funds and gives billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia. And what do they turn around and do? They spread the most vehement form of anti-Semitism and the most significant anti-Christ religion throughout the earth with their oil money. We give them protection, and they stab us in the back. Folks, the fact that we are doing foolish and squirrely things with our foreign policy is not proof that the United States is the Antichrist. And it certainly doesn't mean that the United States is in biblical prophecy, nor does it mean that Russia is. We cannot look to these things that Russia is doing as somehow proof that we need to make the Bible say something that it's not saying, because it's simply not there. It's simply not there. Next slide. In conclusion, again, I want to reiterate, the prophetic imagination of the church today is captivated. And again, I can't underscore the degree to which this is grasping the church. Go to the bookstore, pick up virtually any prophecy book. It is going to be talking about the soon coming invasion of Israel by Russia. Okay? The church is captivated by this notion. Yet the biblical evidence for this is primarily based on one word, a highly debatable word at that. Does it seem like we're placing our emphasis in the wrong direction in light of the overwhelming evidence that the Bible places on the Middle East in light of that which is right in front of us? Guys, go out and get a book by Mark Stein. It's called America Alone. It's one of the most depressing books that you'll ever read. And in it, he just lays out the simple fact that the demographics of the earth are pointing to the fact that in a short time, much of Europe, and as Russia as well, will be an Islamic entity. Because the bottom line, folks, is that the majority of Western nations today are aborting themselves into oblivion, and we're experiencing significant population decline. And the Islamic world is exploding. The demographics don't lie, okay? There is something on the horizon. We can't change it. There is a great revival taking place in the Islamic world today. Okay, that's fantastic. That is awesome. But it's not enough to change the trends that are taking place because of the demographic bomb, if you want to call it that. Okay, this reality is going to force itself. If we haven't woken up to the reality that Islam represents, the threat that it represents, okay, we will soon. We will soon. And in fact, I'm firmly convinced that before this thing completely engulfs the earth, that we're going to see the return of Christ, that is also on the near horizon. Next slide. So, who is Gog? Okay, who is Gog? During Ezekiel's day, simply put, Gog was a name that was given to the king of Lydia. The king of Lydia, who was called Gyges by the Greeks, and Gugu by the Assyrians. All hail King Gugu, the king of Synecdoche. Anyway, so thus Gog, Gog is associated with Lydia, which is in modern-day Turkey, modern-day Western Turkey. Next slide. There you have a map of the former Lydian kingdom. It's much of the western, central and western portion of modern-day Turkey. Again, history shows us that Gog was the name given to a king of the Lydian kingdom of modern-day Turkey. Next slide. And then there's this clue, and again, this is going back to what I was saying before. In order to identify who Gog is, we need to remember that Gog is from Magog. He is the chief prince of what? Meshech and Tubal. And as we'll see in a second, Meshech and Tubal were both in Turkey. So he is the chief prince of two areas of Turkey. Another hint that points us to the fact that Gog is from Turkey. Next slide. Okay, now Magog. Gog is from the land of Magog. There are two options when you really dig into the Bible dictionaries and the historical atlases of the Bible and all of these things, not the prophecy books that are essentially trying oftentimes to direct us toward a little bit of a hypey perspective that again, a coming invasion of Russia sells. But the coming Turkish Empire is not quite as exciting. But when you look at the Bible dictionaries, when you look at all of the different references, there are usually two options given for the identification of Magog. The first is that it refers to the Scythians, and that's based on some statements made by Josephus and some ancient historians. The second is that it refers to Asia Minor and the Lydians. Okay? Now, let's look at both of those. Let's see which one is more reasonable. Next slide. Let's look at Scythia first. First of all, scholars say that it's highly unlikely, and they mention the fact, they discuss the fact that Scythia came to become a general term to refer to any northern peoples. It was similar to a word that we use today, like barbarian. It doesn't, if someone says, man, you're just like a barbarian, they're not saying, you are from the people group that used to live in the former regions of Germany. No, they're saying you're like, a gorilla. You're a nut. Likewise, in ancient times, to call someone a Scythian was sort of a vague reference to any group of just a wild bunch of people that lived in the north. So to identify it as a very specific region and people, most scholars agree that it's fairly highly unlikely. Okay, and as some have said, it has no support from historical anthropology. In other words, it's speculation. We don't have any actual historical documents in ancient history that say the Scythians were called the Magogites. It is just speculation. Next slide. Here's a map of ancient Scythia. So let's just say it is referring to Scythia. Let's just say it is. That is the map of the greatest region of ancient Scythia. Now, the next map, next slide, shows another example of where Scythia was located, which is simply Ukraine. Okay, so there's actually quite a bit of debate regarding the Scythians, where they were located, and the reason is it's because they were highly nomadic people. They were moving around all the time. They were just a tribe of barbarians. Next slide. If we do go with the notion that Magog is referring to Scythia, and we do go with the maps that point to the greatest expansion of where Scythia was, here's the issue. The primary nation that it's pointing us to is Kazakhstan. Secondly, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Ukraine, and it cuts up into Russia a bit, as well as Georgia and Azerbaijan. So here's the thing, guys. Next slide. If Scythia is Magog, okay, then let me ask you this question. Russia is only one of the 12 potential nations that Scythia would be pointing us to. Why are there not books about the coming Kazakhstanian invasion of Israel? Why is the emphasis placed simply on Russia, the coming Russian invasion? Because that's exciting, guys. And I hate to say it, but it sells. And the biblical evidence points us to, if it's Scythia at all, it points us to a coalition of nations, primarily Muslim, maybe with some Russian invasion as well. But all of the emphasis is placed on Russia because why? They're our great historical enemy throughout the Cold War, the great atheist communist nation. Of course, the Antichrist would come from there. And Jesus is going to ascend to Independence, Missouri. America's the New Jerusalem. People throughout history have always tried to cast themselves as the prophetic New Jerusalem and their enemies as the Antichrist. We need to build our theories based on what the Bible tells us and not what our, based on who we would like to cast as the Antichrist nations. Next slide. Further problems. Again, if Magog is Scythia, then the verse makes very little sense. It would be like saying Gog of Russia and Central Asia, chief prince of Turkey. How would that work? Next slide. However, if Magog is referring to Asia Minor, as this one particular ancient map does show, then the verse makes complete sense. Gog is of Magog, which is Turkey. He is the chief prince of Meshech and Tubal, both in Turkey. It makes complete sense. It's far more reasonable. It's not quite as exciting. It's not quite as, cutting edge in terms of current events and so forth, but it makes far more sense in terms of the information that the Bible's giving us. Next slide. Number 3, Gog is the ruler of Meshech and Tubal. Again, Meshech and Tubal are modern-day Turkey. If Gog is the ruler of Turkey, then in essence he has to be from Turkey. And if Gog is from the land of Magog, then Magog also has to be Turkey. Again, it's really the only way that you can make the verse make any sense. Next slide. So we've identified Gog of Magog. We're looking at the modern-day nation of Turkey. Okay, Gog of Magog. Okay, Gomer. Let's identify Gomer. Gomer is simply Gemara, which became Cimmeria, which became Cappadocia, central Turkey. Let's look at the map. Oh, it's a terrible map, but central Turkey. That's the region of Gomer, okay? So far we have Gog of Magog, Turkey, and Gomer also, once again, pointing us to Turkey. Next slide. Beth Togarmah, the house of Togarmah. It is primarily referring to southeastern Turkey, although it could include Armenia, Azerbaijan, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. Okay? Primarily, it's focusing on southeastern Turkey, but it could include that region which extends to the southeast of Turkey, including some of these other nations. Let's look at a map of that. Okay? So that's the region that we're looking at. You can see Israel is directly south of Turkey. You have Syria and Lebanon, and then Israel immediately below that. Next slide. Then you have Persia. Persia is mentioned as being part of this final Antichrist coalition. Again, Persia correlates primarily to the modern-day nation of Iran, although ancient biblical Persia, as mentioned during the time of Gog, could have very well included portions of Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Turkmenistan as well. Next slide. So that would have been the region of ancient Persia, okay? Again, a vast area. You can see Turkey up there right next to ancient Persia. Next slide. Cush. As I said earlier, some translations interpret Cush as Ethiopia. It is primarily speaking of the modern-day nation of Sudan. It is the region that rested just south of Egypt. It could as well include Ethiopia. By the grace of God, it won't. Ethiopia is one of the, in my opinion, one of the greatest ancient Christian nations with some of the most noble people in the earth. And by the grace of God, Ethiopia will not be part of the coming Antichrist coalition. But if we're looking at the map of what ancient Cush could have involved, it may have involved Ethiopia as well as Somalia and Djibouti. Next slide. So that's that whole region down there. And it actually extended over to Yemen as well. Okay, so there was quite a bit of exchange between Africa and the southern tip of Arabia. And so if you were to go to Yemen today, many of the Arabs there tend to be quite a bit darker than, say the Arabs from Syria or something like that. There's been quite a bit of exchange over the centuries between what the Bible calls the Cushites. Next slide. Put is primarily speaking of Libya, but it could also include all of the northern Africa, the regions that extend to the west of Egypt. So it could include Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and actually even Mauritania. Next slide. And I'll mention just briefly, there you have Mauritania, the only nation in the earth today, which still, if you're in Mauritania and you're an Arab, then chances are that you are a slave owner. And if you're black, if you're African, then you're probably a slave to an Arab slave owner. It's the only nation in the world. It's illegal, but it's technically illegal, but it only became illegal several years ago. It's still openly practiced. The only nation on the earth that still openly practices black slavery. And you don't see any great Islamic protests about that. Next slide. So we have identified the 7 heads of the beast, and we have identified the locations, the nations, the primary nations that will compose the coming Antichrist empire. Next slide. There you have a picture of the revived Islamic empire. We're looking at Turkey, Libya, Sudan, Iraq, Iran, Syria, Lebanon, possibly Afghanistan and Pakistan, and again, possibly Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, Mauritania, to the west of Libya. That is a picture of the coming reformed Islamic empire that the Bible tells us we will see in the days to come. Now, next slide. There is presently a call going out throughout the Islamic world for the reestablishment of the caliphate. Now, again, I mentioned in 1924, the office of the caliph was abolished. The caliphate ended after 1,300 years. Today, there is a groundswell throughout the Islamic world. This is the website for a group called Hizb ut-Tahrir. It is a movement that is gaining massive momentum throughout the earth for the reestablishment of the office of the caliph. Can you imagine if Catholics had gone roughly 80-plus years without a pope? And there's a cry throughout the Muslim world saying, reestablish the office of the caliph. Next slide. There's another magazine. An interesting thing that is coming out of this movement for the Khalifa is that they claim that we have seen with the global financial crisis the downfall of capitalism. We have seen, even as communism fell a few decades ago, we are now seeing they're claiming the collapse of capitalism. And they stand forward and they're saying, we have the answer. The answer, ladies and gentlemen, according to much of the Muslim world today, is the reestablishment of the caliphate. Next slide. There's the flag, and on the flag, of course, is the Islamic Shahada. There's no God but Allah. Muhammad is the prophet, the final messenger of Allah. And you'll see that flag waved and carried by a lot of the jihadists. They are marching under the banner of the caliph, calling for the reestablishment of the caliphate. Next slide. There's the logo for the Hizb ut-Tahrir. Next slide. This group is having gatherings all over the world now. This took place in Indonesia about a year and a half ago. I want to say they had about 120,000 people turn out for this rally. Reestablish the caliphate. I mean, it drew in people from all over. That is a huge rally, filling stadiums, crying out for the reestablishment of the Islamic leadership. Next slide. Awakening of the Giant. That was the banner that went up for it. Next slide. They've got speakers and the need for political unity. You need to understand, these are not just all, radicals, Al-Qaeda. These are intellectuals. These are doctors. These are educated individuals that claim to be very nonviolent. And interestingly enough, in nations like Britain, it's very well allowed. But throughout much of the Islamic world, Hizb ut-Tahrir is completely illegal. Okay, because the Muslim nations, the Muslim governments know the threat that that thing represents. Britain, no problem. Just, let it go, and they carry on the spreading of their movement throughout Britain. Next slide. As a matter of fact, that last image was taken place in a gathering that takes place in London every year, and they have as much as 20 to 30,000 people attend every year for this big seminar discussing the reestablishment of the caliphate. And I've had a former Muslim friend who actually goes to the conference every year and reports about the events and attends some of the seminars and does a little report regarding what's taken place there. So again, Ezekiel 38 told us that the coming revived Islamic Union would be led by Turkey. It emphasizes Turkey. The leader, the Antichrist, Gog, is from Turkey, right? Today, the Islamic world there's a groundswell calling for the reestablishment of the caliphate. But not only that, folks, there is also going out a specific call for an Islamic Union led by Turkey. This is not something simply that I am pulling out of the Bible. It's also happening within the Islamic world. Next slide. Okay. This is an article that was in the news on the internet, just Arshak Al-Wasat. It's the largest daily Arabic newspaper in the Middle East. This was just released, I believe, this week. I just pulled this up this week. And the article, the title there, you probably can't see it, The Return of the Ottoman Empire. And what political observers are taking note of is the fact that Turkey is reasserting itself suddenly over the past few years and leaving behind, to a great degree, its secular past and re-embracing and turning back toward its Ottoman history. And commentators throughout the Middle East are taking note of the emerging leadership role that Turkey is playing in Middle Eastern politics. Next slide. We are also seeing specific calls coming out of Turkey for the emergence of a Turkish Islamic Union led by Turkey. This comes out by a group. Actually, it's a Turkish intellectual, multimillionaire. His name is Adnan Oktar, and he's written, I want to say, 200 books, and he's well-funded, and he's involved in this campaign to push for the concept of a Turkish-led Islamic Union. The understanding is being presented that if the Islamic world would return to the Ottoman Caliphate, they could revive their glory days. That the reason they've been in such disarray for the past 80 years is because of the lack of the presence of one unifying government. Next slide. There is a map, a proposed map of the coming Turkish Islamic Union as visualized by these groups. One more map which zooms in a bit. You can see there Turkey right in the center. And it's interesting to note that that thing goes way up into Russia, goes all the way over into India, I think all the way, it covers quite a bit. That is what's being proposed, and while it is not widely embraced yet, it's just interesting to note that that thing is emerging, that concept is emerging from out of the Islamic world, all the way back to 2004. In Antichrist, after searching the scriptures, I said, look, right now in Turkey, there's no reason to see Turkey emerge as the leader of some Islamic Union, but maybe in the years ahead we will see it. Well, this was just released about 2 months ago. Next slide. So there's Erdogan on the left. He's the Prime Minister of Israel, and the Prime Minister of Turkey, and he's the primary mover and shaker of Turkey. President Gül is really sort of a secondary player there. It's the prime minister that's taking the leadership role. And it's interesting that in the past few years, we've seen a significant coming together of Turkey and many of the nations that would form the final Antichrist empire. So there's Turkey and Sudan's president, al-Bashir. It's interesting that, the past year, the Turks were celebrating the fact that they arrested this particular Serbian guy that was, I'm not even sure of his name, that was involved in, great genocide during the Bosnian-Serbian clash, and the world courts did deal justice to him. He was the butcher of Bosnia. But yet they're celebrating al-Bashir, the butcher of Sudan. You know, this guy is responsible for one of the most horrific genocides, in essence, against the indigenous Africans in the South, whether they be Muslim, Christian, or animists, by the more Arab-dominated, controlling Sudanese government. I mean, and there's a little bit more to it politically, but by and large, that genocide is being supported by the government. And here, Turkey has been recently building bonds, economic ties with Sudan, the nation of Sudan. Next slide. Then you have Erdogan with our little buddy Ahmadinejad. And little needs to be said about him. Not exactly the individual that I would want to shake hands with. One of the most vehement vocal anti-Semitic individuals in the earth today. And Turkey, formerly one of the United States and Israel's greatest allies, is now suddenly turning toward the Middle East, and specifically toward some of the most anti-Semitic nations in the Middle East. Next slide. And there's Erdogan with Assad, Bashar Assad. Turkey has developed significant strengthening ties, both economic as well as defense ties with Syria. Next slide. I mean, this guy is everywhere. Erdogan's everywhere. And then this one's real interesting. This just came out just this past week. Muammar Gaddafi, however you say it, was recently declared the King of Kings over the African Union. And he's calling for what he's calling the United States of Africa. And Libya would take the leadership role of that. It's interesting to note that Gaddafi is also the leader of the North African Mediterranean Union, which specifically includes, okay, ready? Libya, Morocco, Algeria, Mauritania, and Tunisia. Okay, he's the head over all of that. Next slide. And of course, we've seen growing and continued growing ties between Libya and Sudan because they're, for the most part, neighbors. There's Gaddafi and al-Bashir. Next slide. All of these nations are significantly coming together. They're forming and increasing bonds of unity. And it's happening rapidly. I mean, I follow these things. It's really, the past year or two, it's suddenly just exploded. Now, the NIC is the National Intelligence Council, and on its website, it says it is the U.S. intelligence community's center for midterm and long-term strategic thinking. Okay, it's a non-governmental think tank composed of experts from around the world, and they give intelligence. They are the U.S. intelligence communities, the CIA and so forth. They are their premier source of midterm and long-term strategic thinking. And just every couple of years, every 5 years, they gather together experts from all around the world, and they put together a report where they speculate on what we should expect to see in the world in a handful of years from now. So a couple of years ago, they released a document called Project 2020. Okay? Again, this is secular intelligence, U.S. intelligence think tank. And in Project 2020, next slide, they called it Mapping the Global Future, report of the National Intelligence Council's 2020 project. What they said, now get this, they said that by the year 2020, we should expect to see a revived Islamic caliphate. Okay, this is American intelligence. So, next slide. Not only does biblical prophecy say that we will soon see a revived caliphate, the Islamic world is rallying for a revived caliphate. Islamic intelligence. American intelligence is also predicting a revived caliphate. All trends are merging in the same place. Next slide. Now, let's look very briefly at what I'm calling the resistor nations, okay? I spoke about nations that would resist the Antichrist coalition. Let's look at a few of those. You see, as people have watched the Middle East evolve over the past few years, usually this is what they say, and they kind of think in a very American way. They say, well, won't we see the Sunni nations align with the Sunni nations and the Shia nations align with the Shia nations? No. What we're actually seeing is the emergence of more of a radical bloc, and on the other side, more of a Western-friendly bloc. Okay? So the radical bloc, whether they're, Turkish, primarily Sunnis, with Iran, primarily Shia, or Libya, primarily Sunni, uniting with Iran, it doesn't matter. They're unifying less around sectarian issues and more around the issue of whether they are a bit more radical and a bit more Islamic, or whether they're more Western friendly. So here you have the three Middle Eastern nations that I believe will not willingly join the Antichrist coalition. And this is referred to as the Arab bloc, often referred to as the Arab bloc. That's Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan. Next slide. Okay, Saudi Arabia. Here's why I believe Saudi Arabia will not be part of the Antichrist coalition. In Ezekiel 38:13, again, we know that it's describing the Antichrist and his invasion. It says, Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all of the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, Art thou come to take spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take prey? So basically what this is, it's a protest. And so Sheba and Dedan, these are cities in Saudi Arabia. And so what we have here is Saudi Arabian cities saying to Gog, saying to the Antichrist during the time of his invasion, well, what, are you coming to take spoil, booty, and plunder? Is that what you're doing? And there's sort of a protest that rises up. The merchants of Tarshish is a bit of a difficult one, but many speculate that it's actually referring to ancient Spain, but that it came to represent all of Western Europe. Okay, so some speculate that it's sort of a general term referring to Europe. So this would be saying essentially Saudi Arabia and the West. There will be a protest that will arise from Saudi Arabia and the West against those nations that we just saw that will unify and come together against Israel. Next slide. Jordan and Egypt. Speaking of the Antichrist, it says, He shall enter into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand, even Edom, Moab, and the chief of the children of Ammon. Again, those three names put together most likely refer to the modern-day nation of Jordan. It says that Jordan will escape out of the hand of the Antichrist. And then also in that same passage we saw that the king of the south, that's Egypt, is clashing with the Antichrist. They're actually at war. Egypt does not want to submit to the coming Antichrist coalition. Next slide. Egypt. There it is. At that time of the end, the king of the south shall push against the Antichrist. And then it eventually says that Egypt will fall. Egypt will fall. Next slide. It's interesting. So there you have the Arab bloc, the resistor nations, as I'm calling them, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. And it's interesting to note that of the three nations, the only real three nations that the Bible specifically says will not be allied willingly with the Antichrist, it's interesting to see that today, that those three nations have indeed formed a bloc, and that they are indeed the three most prominent Western-friendly nations, as well as some of the smaller Gulf states, Dubai and so forth. Next slide. And there it is in the newspaper. Arab shame, Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. This was January 9th. The Arab world was furious, or the Islamic world was furious with which nations? Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Why? Because they were not standing with the Palestinians during the recent Gaza conflict with Israel. They were not vocally coming out violently against Israel, and the Arabs say, shame on you. The Islamic world says, shame on you, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia. Next slide. This is from the Middle Eastern Review of International Affairs. And you can see it says the anti-Iranian front, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Jordan. You see, right now in the Middle East, what you have essentially is Saudi Arabia is the primary oil-producing top dog of the Middle East, okay? Iran is significantly emerging as the second top dog, and it is gaining significant power to the point where the whole Arab world is afraid of Iranian influence. And they know that Iran is not an insignificant nation. They've already, through proxy, conquered Lebanon. They also, to a great degree, help sway over Syria. They could very easily, in a day if they wanted, they could take Qatar, Bahrain, Dubai. There's a significant Shia population there. It wouldn't be hard for them to threaten to launch missiles and so forth. The Iranian power is significant, and Saudi Arabia is very much depending on the United States to protect them from the emerging Iranian power. But it's interesting, the anti-Iranian front, who is it? Egypt, Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. Who are they afraid of? Iran, one of the premier nations of the coming beast coalition, the coming Antichrist coalition. Next slide. Is that it? Okay. Folks, the point is, the Bible gives us very specific information about specific nations that we would see in the last days come together and invade the land of Israel. The Bible tells us that the end result of that is that there will be a leader that will emerge from out of those peoples. There will be a leader that will emerge, and that he will lead the Islamic world in an invasion of Israel. Israel will be conquered, okay? A significant percentage of the inhabitants of Israel will be killed. Of those that are left, many will be taken captive. Those nations that the Bible specifies are all coming together. Now, let me just throw this one out. I focused on Ezekiel 38 because I think it's one of the clearest passages that points us to who the nations are. I could have also turned to Revelation 13. Okay? Revelation 13 talks about that beast. And it's interesting to note that it says that the beast would be a composite of the lion, the leopard, and the bear. Okay? This is a reference back to Daniel 7, where the lion was Babylon, the leopard was Greece, and the bear was Persia. Okay? Think Babylon, think Iraq. Okay? Leopard, think Greece, think Turkey. And bear, think Iran. Okay? Iraq, Iran, Turkey. It says that the final beast empire would look like a composite of the ancient Babylonian, Persian, and Greek empires. That's how it describes him. Again, that correlates perfectly with what we see, the nations that we've seen described in Ezekiel 38. The Bible tells us where to look. The Bible tells us where to watch. Today, those nations are coming together. The Bible also gives us hints into those nations that will resist. Those nations have also formed a coalition, if you will, a bloc. Folks, these things are taking place before our eyes rapidly, and the majority of the church today is looking to Europe, and they're waiting for the Antichrist to emerge out of Europe. Folks, Europe today is one of the weakest, most linguini-spined coalition of nations in the world, and we expect them overnight to suddenly emerge as the iron-toothed beast that will stomp down the earth. The eyes of the church are looking in completely the wrong direction. Many of you here have been studying prophecy for many years, and the reason is because the Lord has drawn you to that. Many of you will be called to even help prepare the church, to help wake the church up, even as, and not to over-dramatize this, but even as John the Baptist came to prepare the way of the Lord. Okay, there's many of you that will be called to help prepare. Maybe one, maybe two, maybe many, but to help people become prepared, because these things are taking place. It's not just fantasy. It's not just interesting trivia. It's not just a distraction from the weekly sermons about tithing and so forth. These things are real. They have very real and deep implications in all of our lives. We need to pay attention, and we need the church to wake up, because the hour is near. Amen.